We're good? Great. Welcome, everybody, to the final panel of the afternoon. I realize that we are doing this both on top of food and that a lot of you will be heading out for flights. We're going to end this at 1:20-ish, so because I know there's a 1:30 shuttle that various people need to get to. On the other hand, I should just note that this panel, there's nothing theoretical about it. And in fact, not only are the issues incredibly timely, that is to say, decisions will be made within the next few months, they also involve tens of billions of dollars, reminding me of my favorite footnote. Probably the only thing I remember from law school was footnote 8 of Marv Churlstein's income tax book, which was referring to a case that involved $300, and Marv wrote, "The reader is invited here as elsewhere in this book to add as many zeros as necessary to make the problem seem important." C-band is important. You don't even have to add zeros in your imagination. I'm going to skip the introductions because most of you actually know all of these people, but if not, they're in the bios, except to say that Kathleen Ham couldn't join us. So Greg Roston, an economist with Stanford, who's also has a great legacy at the FCC, will be representing T-Mobile on this. What I'm going to do is simply kind of lay a very quick framework. We're going to go through a round where everybody gets to state kind of what they think the FCC should do, then do another round where everyone says the most important thing for the FCC to avoid doing, and then we'll get into some specific questions, and again, hopefully end by about 1:20. So what the FCC has to resolve, and they are busy at work doing this, and probably will have, in the last quarter of this year, we'll have an item voted on. They have to answer a number of questions that are all interlinked. How much spectrum will be reallocated, how to structure that spectrum for sale, rules to assist rural areas, designated entities, if any, a cap, if any, on what any entity purchasing the spectrum can own, how the sales process be run, how do you distribute the proceeds to various stakeholders and to the U.S. Treasury, if that's important, how soon the spectrum will be made available for 5G purposes, what are the right interference limits, how do you administer a transition, and how to do all of these things in ways that avoid a court either delaying or striking down what the FCC did. And I might note, we talked about this with the panelists, we're not going to get into the legal issues. This isn't actually, we're going to try to stay on the policy and economic issues, but there are a lot of different legal issues implicated by that. Chairman Pai has described this as a Rubik's Cube and the most difficult decision the FCC has ever reached. You know, every chairman thinks they reached the most difficult decision ever reached. But I will say it is a difficult one. So I'd like to start by asking each of the panelists, I'm going to start with Peter representing the CBA, to just tell us, and I'm going to be really strict on time limits, everyone has 3 minutes to answer a question, but no more. What is the most important thing for the FCC in thinking about this? What should they do? What's the affirmative case for what the FCC should do?
Okay, thanks, Blair. Welcome to Endgame. By the way, I'm calling dibs on playing Peter Parker, a.k.a. the Amazing Spider-Man. And I want to incorporate by reference Blair's comment that this is extremely important. I believe it's probably the single most important thing that the U.S. government can prudently do to foster 5G in the U.S., but it's really complicated. There are two problems here that briefly need to be mentioned. First, there's the one that Blair mentioned, which is how do you decide how to clear this spectrum? It's currently used by a very valuable broadcast service delivering TV and radio to nearly over 100 million households. How much, when, where, how it should all be done? Extremely difficult questions. And then one that doesn't get enough attention is that each of the 4 satellite companies who help distribute this programming have a non-exclusive right to use the entire 500 megahertz over the entire continental United States, so there's a huge potential for a holdup problem. So what's to be done? The situation cries out for a market-driven process, one that's bottom-up, decentralized, that best harnesses incentives and the available information. That's exactly what the C-band alliance proposal does. By giving flexibility to these companies, they will have strong incentives to clear spectrum where it's efficient. They've already come together to form an alliance, solving the holdout problem voluntarily. When I was back at Intel, we went to Intelsat, persuaded them we didn't need to have a food fight. They got SES on board, and finally you got all 4 companies together. Big deal. Also, these companies see the big picture, and this is absolutely crucial because they know their customers, they value their continued goodwill, they've sat down and worked with them to come up with plans that assure them that they will be kept whole. But the crucial point for this group as a policy point is because they have flexibility, they face the opportunity cost of not clearing this spectrum. They have looked at the bidding. They've gone from 150 megahertz cleared with a 50 megahertz guard band to 200 with a 20 megahertz guard band. They're now looking at using compression technologies to clear even more spectrum. They've worked with the engineers at Nokia, AT&T, Verizon to make the spectrum
15 seconds. Wrap it up.
make the spectrum even more valuable for 5G. These are the exact things you would expect to happen when companies face the opportunity costs of not clearing the spectrum. Thought experiment, would an administrative process done anything as well as that?
Ross.
Thanks. It's nice to be here and to be on this panel with some of the top minds in telecommunications industry and to be part of it. I represent small and medium-sized cable television operators that are heavily dependent on the C-band for the delivery of video services. They're also broadband providers. And so we come here, and so the question is, what should the FCC do? Not surprisingly, the FCC should adopt the 5G Plus plan that ACA connects, along with Charter Communications, along with the Competitive Carriers Association, represents rural wireless carriers, have put forth to the FCC on July 2nd of this year as a counter-proposal to what the CBA has provided. It is a diverse group that represents both incumbent Earth Station users, which would be impacted by the CBA plan, as well as by prospective bidders who are interested in gaining access to the C-band for use for 5G deployment. Just to give you some, to lay out what the 5G plan offers, it proposes to make available 370 megahertz on a nationwide basis, which opens up the opportunities for new entrants and small carriers to participate in the marketplace. It makes it available through an FCC-led auction, which ensures fairness and transparency. It includes the deployment of 120,000 new fiber route miles in rural America, which positions rural America really for the 5G and for future viability. It does it in a time frame that we think can beat the CBA's plan. It guarantees billions of dollars to the U.S. Treasury, which is really politically paramount. It provides reimbursement of all reallocation costs and incentives to C-band licensees, as well as Earth Station registrants, which we think is obviously a necessity, and we think that the satellite industry can actually get a great deal of funding as a result of the implementation of our plan, and it provides the proper technical protections for 5G interference, which is essential for the users that are going to continue on the band. So just quickly, how can this be achieved? It's what we propose is to migrate the MVPD industry, which uses more than 50% of the band today, to fiber. And we're going to, and the reason why this works is because such a small percentage of MVPD Earth Station users are actually receiving that. So you get the most bang for the buck. You can provide fiber to the smallest number of Earth Station users and clear the most amount to spectrum. And so, that's why we think that's why we think that it's doable, and it's certainly affordable. 370 megahertz can raise up to $40 billion. Our plan estimated costs about $10 billion. Even with incentives, the U.S. Treasury can get billions and billions of dollars.
Thank you. Greg.
Great. So since I'm time constrained, I'll be quick on the introduction stuff. First, I'm working for T-Mobile, but I'm not T-Mobile. They don't always listen to me, but you guys are going to listen to me today because I have the stage. What the social goal here is to have the spectrum used in its most productive service. And I think we all agree, or at least I hope we agree on that. The key is how do we get there, and then what is there? So to me, it's been flexible use licenses in terms of technical and service provision, subject to interference constraints. And getting there may involve changes that have positive and negative effects on different parties. So there is pretty clear to me in this. It's 500 megahertz of fully flexible licensing. Anything that doesn't get there or have a clear path to get there is a failure. We have the ability to get 500 megahertz. It's key to 5G, and we can do this. So right now we have 500 megahertz used for satellite delivery of programming. There are three types of parties in this: satellite operators, programmers, and earth stations. Sometimes some of these people are involved in at least two of the parts. So I'm going to go with the constraint that there needs to be a way of coming out of this transition to enable earth stations to get content from programmers. It doesn't have to come from satellites. Milk delivery, when I was a kid, came to our house. It stopped. We figured out a new way to get milk. Satellite programmers will figure out different ways of getting their programming to earth stations. So T-Mobile looked at this problem and said, what's the problem? The interference concern, as Dale Hatfield will tell you, is that there is terrestrial use that would interfere with earth stations. So satellites can keep transmitting in different areas or across the country and not have harm. So if an area has no earth stations or sufficiently protected earth station, there's no problem. So the CBA proposal has the CBA and CBA alone with selling the spectrum. But there's also the earth stations who could have the right to cease for operations and free up the spectrum, free up 500 megahertz. So the incentive auction proposal allows earth stations to compete in the auction to move spectrum to more efficient use. It's very similar incentive auction to the one that Paul Milgram helped design for the FCC, with changes to fit the details of this. You start with a forward auction, you see how much money you get for 500 megahertz. And then in every area, earth stations and satellites compete to say, are you willing to go off the air? If someone's willing to go off the air, we do it. If not, it's very similar to the incentive auction and we go down. So this is ways we can figure out the details about how to get people to bid and provide incentives. The bottom line is that the T-Mobile proposal has competing bidders figuring out the efficient amount of spectrum transitioned. There's no limit below 500 megahertz. The limit is 500. And it could get a significant amount of money to the Treasury. And in response, everybody can be better off. It gets us to the 500 megahertz with an open, competitive FCC-run process. And that's 3 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much. Claude.
That's fantastic. That was very impressive, Greg. So I'm Claude Aiken, President and CEO of WISPA, the voice of the fixed wireless industry here in the United States. And it's actually great to be here talking C-band because we have the somewhat dubious and be in the good position of being first to the game on C-band. It was the Broadband Access Coalition's petition for rulemaking back in 2017 that kind of kicked off this whole process where we took a look at the C-band and said, hey, this is being underutilized. You have small transponders pointed at a fixed location in the sky, but that are getting full band, full arc protection. The terrestrial use of the spectrum could be much greater than it actually is. There was some limited point-to-point use before, and there continues to be in the band for terrestrial. But I think we agree with Greg that we would like to see all 500 megahertz utilized terrestrially. So our proposal initially back in 2017, as part of a broad coalition that included service providers, public interest, and other groups, was to share that spectrum with the satellite earth stations. Now, part of being the little guy in the room is things tend to run away from you. So now, a couple years later, in this rulemaking, we're very pleased that the chairman has sought comments on our proposal, which is the following. We understand that The race to 5G has taken on a whole craze of its own. We understand that the large mobile carriers want to have flexible use spectrum. We're fine with clearing and auctioning 200 megahertz of spectrum. In order to protect existing uses in the band, we proposed some robust interference protections backed up by a study that shows that all you need is 10 kilometers of geographic separation from an earth station in order for fixed point-to-multipoint radios to be able to effectively utilize the spectrum terrestrially without causing harmful interference to earth stations. Now what that does is if you take the original CBA proposal to clear 200, you authorize sharing in the other 300 that allows for 80 million Americans to be able to have access to gigabit or near gigabit point-to-multipoint service in the band.
15 seconds, Rob.
And that's why we think ours is the best proposal.
Great. So we've heard proposals, affirmative proposals from 4 different folks. Now we're going to go just reverse order and talk about what's the most important thing for the FCC to avoid.
So I think the most important thing for the FCC to avoid is to overcomplicating matters. One of the benefits of our sharing proposal is that you avoid, you would avoid a complex overlay option, you avoid a long clearing process, and you're able to make large amounts of spectrum available immediately for the chairman's stated top priority of closing the digital divide. This band is immediately adjacent to the CBRS band, which there's already equipment developed and deployed there. So this could be a tremendous boon for rural broadband. So while we have views on other aspects of the proposal, like public-private sale, bidding credits, how much spectrum aggregation limits, we think that if you go down the path of authorizing coordinated shared license use in a significant portion of the C-band, that will have huge positive implications for rural broadband. So that's...
Greg.
Okay, so the FCC should avoid anything that gets them stuck with less than 500 megahertz, with less than a clear path to 500 megahertz. The CBA started with proposing 100 megahertz was all they could do. Then they said, now 180 is the most we can do. Now Peter says they can do more. Well, obviously this is a question sort of like Winston Churchill and the socialite. It's just a question of what the price is that CBA is willing to take. But basically what they're going to do is they're going to spend billions of dollars on new satellites to give 1990s delivery technology when the billions of dollars could be done according to the CCA proposal or ACA proposal for fiber to connect rural areas. This is what the chairman wants. The FCC wants rural fiber connections. These proposals, either the T-Mobile incentive auction or the ACA Connects proposal, provide huge amounts of fiber to rural areas and frees up 500 megahertz of spectrum. Anything less than that is kind of sticking us in the mud. And the idea that this is going to take a lot longer than the CBA proposal is crazy. The CBA proposal will take, they said 36 months is their guess to get 180 megahertz available. Well, 36 months for 180 megahertz means that 320 megahertz is never. That's a lot longer. Never is a lot longer than whatever it takes to fiber up these places. And the thing is that fibering the high-value areas is mostly done. So those will become free more rapidly, much more rapidly, and as you get more into the rural areas, the fiber will free stuff up over time, but it will be the high-value stuff, the efficient stuff will get done quickly, and that's what we should try and strive for, is efficient, quick, and maximum spectrum flexibility and availability.
Ross?
Sure. A few things the FCC shouldn't do. Number one, they shouldn't cause harm to existing users. I think any transition from existing users to new users should make sure that incumbent users are made fully whole, and that's a very important principle here. But beyond that, I don't think that the FCC should allow foreign companies to privately sell spectrum that they don't own and aren't using, and then pocket the net proceeds. I think that the proceeds should be used to go to U.S. companies for U.S. infrastructure and then to the U.S. Treasury. We shouldn't allow the spectrum to be used delivered using an opaque private sale mechanism or a novel privately run auction. There needs to be some standardization, some precedent in the way we make this available and make sure it's fair to all providers. We shouldn't hinder new entrants from entering the 5G market by only allocating 200 megahertz. It's widely expected that the three largest national wireless companies will be able to secure that spectrum. It's only by clearing up a level of 370 megahertz or more that you're going to get additional providers in there. I think the FCC can't think too small here. I think they can't think, let's free up 200 megahertz and then down the road clear up more. I think that's overly costly. What they have to do is figure out the right amount now and figure out the plan moving forward to do it. They shouldn't disproportionately They shouldn't disproportionately harm rural America by providing different levels of spectrum in different parts of the country. They should approach it from a nationwide basis so rural America can benefit as much as urban area. And then finally, I think Greg makes the right point, and I'll just summarize it. We shouldn't be spending money on filters. We should be spending it on fiber.
Peter.
Oh, my God. Do you believe that? That should count against me. What the government, the FCC, shouldn't do is needlessly make a lot of top-down, mother may I, difficult technical and economic questions when they don't need to. The CBA proposal, better than all the alternatives, has one entity internalizing all of the relevant costs and benefits. Often you've heard here today, it's clear we should clear all 500. CBA has asked for flexibility, but is it really marketplace-oriented to upfront decide that all 500 megahertz by a certain date certain should be reallocated? Instead, what we have is a process whereby iteratively an entity has worked with its customers, the content holders, and so on, to make spectrum available but keep them whole. And let's look at what some of the commenters have said about this fiber alternative. The content owners say it's a lot more complex, costly, take a lot more time, reliability challenges. But also, what did AT&T say? AT&T said this fiber proposal needlessly imposes a fiber solution prematurely on an entire industry. Verizon called it a not ready for prime time proposal. There are many details here I could give you. One of them is their fiber plan assumes a particular delivery of satellite programming to cable head ends. If they take that into account, it will require the cable companies to invest in many more antennas. Nor do they take into account the fiber costs for rural systems that are adjacent to urban systems. So let's stick with a reliable, market-based approach, get the incentives right, one entity who will be accountable to protecting programming to 100 million households, but also face the opportunity cost of clearing spectrum when it's efficient.
So now I'm going to go through and ask the panelists individual questions, but start thinking about what questions you all would like to ask. I want to start with Ross. You started by saying no harm to existing users. Peter just noted some of the existing users who have been critical of your proposal. Well, I'd like to give you a chance to respond, and I know, Peter, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to some other things that were said. But Ross, you go first.
Sure. Well, first, I'm not surprised at MVPD programmers' reaction to our plan. we had the same reaction from our own members when they were first exposed to it. And after a few months of education, all MVPDs are now comfortable with what we're suggesting, and I'm expecting that the same will play out with MVPD programmers. And my initial conversations with programmers, and we've had those conversations with all large programmers and a handful of smaller ones who have participated in the docket as well as others, suggest so much. I think that fiber is a commonly used medium for transporting video today. Actually, MVPD programmers use fiber to deliver their content from their studios to uplink centers. They also use it to transport their content from the US overseas. I mean, fiber is nothing new. MVPDs use fiber to transport the signals, the programming feeds between their existing cable systems. Comcast is completely wired up. They may use the C-band today as a backup, but their primary way of delivering all of their video programming across the country is via fiber. Moreover, E911, wireless emergency alerts, a long list of public safety and homeland security services all rely on fiber. Wall Street relies on fiber. The idea that fiber is somehow problematic, can't be used, is just doesn't stand up. The fact is that I think a lot of the concerns that programmers have about what we've suggested was just the lack of detail. And I mean, that's to be expected. We put in our initial proposal, we're not going to solve for every single issue until the proposal has some, air to breathe. But now that we've heard what the specific concerns are, I can tell you that you can build a reliable fiber network. It just requires the right level of redundancy. And the fact that there's fiber cuts doesn't mean that a network can't be reliable. Fiber networks are designed for fiber cuts and to withstand them, and fiber reliability can provide 5 nines reliability or better, which is as good as what satellite delivers. And I'll just end by saying, the type of fiber network that can be designed, that can be reliable, would have multiple paths, will provide geographic diversity where the fiber of the multiple paths are of a certain distance. They will go to multiple data centers with each of the data centers interconnected. There'll be dual homing where it comes into each of the locations from different locations. And then you have redundant equipment. I mean, all of this is sort of basic ways of designing a reliable network. That is what the 5G Plus plan is offering, and we're going to put in more details about this. And I think once programmers see the type of reliable network that they're going to get in exchange for the satellite delivery, that we're going to see a change in tune in terms of their position towards our plan.
Okay.
Yeah, Disney, Fox, Univision, Viacom, Discovery have given this considered attention. Maybe you know their interests better than they do. I'm skeptical.
Claude, we haven't talked on this panel much about the structure of the auction designs.
Sure.
One of the difficulties is how do you make sure that rural folks and smaller enterprises get it? There's a lot of debate, but I think it's fair to say the current majority of the commission is skeptical of set-asides, skeptical of designated entity kinds of things. What are your thoughts on structuring the actual sale process to make sure your members and other smaller entities have a chance?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take the sale process first. So obviously the designated entities and other issues have not been sort of the top of mind advocacy for us. Although we were pleased that in the CBRS context, in the EBS context, the FCC did say that they were going to make available bidding credits for small and rural entities that were looking to acquire that spectrum at auction. I think the more macro issue here from a rural perspective is what are the opportunity costs imposed on rural consumers by not allowing quick use of this spectrum by community-based providers who are already in those areas to allow for robust broadband delivery, to close the digital divide, which, again, the commission has said is their number one priority. We can talk about auction structure and sales structure. If we authorize sharing in the uncleared portion, that is something that can be put to use overnight as opposed to several years down the road. So that's, from our perspective, that's how you take care of rural. That's how you take care of smaller entities that are serving rural and really move the ball forward in that respect.
Greg, I want to ask you, Peter began his talk with a real important point, which is we have to avoid in any kind of sales process, avoiding a last holdout problem. Your proposal has been criticized for not addressing that issue. I want to give you a chance to talk about the holdout problem and how your incentive auction, does it solve it, or is that a fair criticism?
So, Peter brings up an important point about sort of coordination costs. And he says, basically, I think he said we need to put all the rights in a single entity. As an economist, I go, that's a monopoly. What monopolies do is restrict quantity. Well, that's why we're not getting 500 megahertz. There's a monopoly who's restricting quantity. So we don't have that structure. We do, but it does have this incentive problem that we realize in the auction, and we thought about this a lot. We took the very same structure that the FCC used to address this difficult technical questions that Peter also mentioned. They used the FCC incentive auction structure where not everybody who was in the band above 37, channel 37, agreed to move. What they did was they got relocated. They got equivalent facilities, and they get relocated. And that's exactly what's going to happen in our proposal if there is enough interest, but not everybody. So you get rid of, so if you have a few holdouts, you take advantage of the FCC's authority to provide comparable facilities for these remaining earth stations, for example, who might be a holdout. There is definitely a mechanism to do it, and we don't suffer the monopolization problem that the CBA plan would.
Great. Peter, I want to give you a chance to respond to a number of different criticisms that came. But first, if you could, like within a minute, perhaps illuminate us a little bit. The other day before the congressional hearing, you said the companies would be willing to make a voluntary contribution. One of the issues Ross raised was sharing of proceeds with Treasury. Could you elaborate a little bit, but you don't have to go that deep because I know you're not going to, but could you give us a little bit more about
I'm not going to negotiate it with you if that's the
After
question.
all the times we've negotiated together?
Yeah, I love you dearly.
No, could you elaborate a little
Yeah,
bit on that and then address the other criticisms, and then I'm going to open it up to
Yeah,
the
okay,
audience.
very quickly. I did testify before Congress. We are prepared to make a voluntary, significant contribution to the U.S. Treasury. It is legal. It can be enforceable. Our licenses can be conditioned. No question about that. This whole issue of unjust enrichment, it's key to focus on unjust and inefficient. And what we have here is a group of companies who have proposed to come forward and clear 40% or more of their spectrum within 3 years, spend millions of dollars to keep their customers whole and make this available. When has that ever happened in the last 40 years? The answer is never. And the value to society from making this spectrum available 2 or 3 years earlier than possible through a public auction dwarfs the discounted auction values. The consumer welfare here, asked with Professor Hazlett, is likely to be 10 to 20 times the auction revenues. Any year of delay gets lost right away. In terms of this holdout problem, there are two separate issues. There's the do we have market power? Separate issue. You look at the relevant market. It wouldn't be, if you look at elasticities and so on, it would not make sense for us to restrict output. But note that my dear friend Greg did not really answer the holdout problem. What we have here is a situation where he's trying to use a complement, earth stations, as a substitute. Legally, it's fraught, but just think of this thought experiment for a second. Imagine a company came into a local broadcast market and said, I've now struck a deal with all the remaining 20% of the households who receive their broadcasting content over the air, they're all going to move to cable. I now want the broadcaster's license. Would that be legal? Would that likely take a long time to get through? The answer is it would not be legal, and we'd be here for a long time if that's the approach that was taken.
Great. Well, I was frankly hoping that by now we would have gotten complete consensus among these four who would have solved this problem. I regret that I've obviously failed as a Mideast negotiator. I, of course, have many more questions, but I'd like to open it up to the audience for any questions. Michael, in the back.
Hi.
Could you ask him to identify?
Yeah, can you please identify yourself before you ask the question?
Michael Stein from Maniquet. One thing I've just been wondering, the uplink 600, or the uplink C-band, the 6 gigahertz range, is there any reason why you couldn't repack that to use it as downlink and then clear the whole, the whole 4 gigahertz band?
Well,
Sorry. Go ahead.
the propagation characteristics of this spectrum that make it really great for terrestrial mobile also make it very attractive to deliver video content to broadcast affiliates and cable head ends. So there would be issues with doing that. And again, we're not against fiber. It's just the point is that doing it as quickly as some have said, foisting a fiber solution on the market too quickly doesn't make sense. So let's sort it out in the marketplace. We're all about, over the next few years, economically, rationally moving this in the most efficient direction.
Anybody else want to address that?
I would add that in the 6 gigahertz band, there's much more robust terrestrial fixed point-to-point use already. So that's an additional complicating factor there.
Other questions from the audience? Well, I'd like to ask, Tom, did you?
Wait.
Tom, even you have to identify yourself. I'm sorry, it's the rules.
Hi, I'm Blair Levin.
I wondered where I was.
So Peter talks about the time. Maybe the different plans could talk about the timing and what they think their challenges are, and what maybe sell their plan based upon the timing, as the transaction cost issue is certainly front and center there.
Great. Why don't we just, Claude,
Sure.
just go down.
So the timing for ours is pretty simple. It's overnight. If you authorize sharing, the equipment just requires software upgrades. 80 million more Americans can get access to gigabit or near gigabit broadband. It's pretty simple.
Greg?
So I'm not an expert on the legal process and the challenges, but both plans, I think, are incentive auction or the ACA Connects auction would go forward. They may be a little longer than taking the private auction that Peter is proposing, but the deployment, it's a question of the clearing, not the actual timing of the auction. The clearing, they say, would take 3 years to get 180 megahertz. My guess is that in major metropolitan areas, you could have fiber connecting all of the head ends and clearing a lot of the spectrum within 3 years. So the timing is pretty close for 180 megahertz, and there's no race for the remaining 320 megahertz. They're not in the race. The rest of it is. So, I think that Ross's plan should be a starting point. Start with 370 and have a plan that maybe takes time, maybe takes a few more years to get the remaining 130, but this is a great starting point. Whatever it is, there's got to be a path to 500, and the CBA plan has no path to 500.
Ross?
Yep. So we think in major markets we can beat the CBA. The CBA plan depends upon the launch of 5 satellites that have to be successful, and then the repointing and installation of filters on something like 60,000 different antennas across the country in order to clear the 200 megahertz. Under our plan, what we're suggesting is that you clear the MVPDs of their use of the C-band in major urban markets. These markets are defined as markets where all the fiber that you need is already in existence. So New York, LA, We're talking about MVPDs, the largest MVPDs in the country, who are serving these markets, who are broadband providers, who already have the fiber connectivity. There is nothing that they need to do in terms of any deployments whatsoever. And so what we say is within 18 months, and let's also say many of the programmers as well have fiber. They're delivering their content to the Earth Station uplink centers, and so they just need to enter into a deal with a Zayo or a CenturyLink in order to get to the handful of data centers where the initial clearing will occur, and enter into agreements. This can be done within 18 months, and certainly if it took a year longer, it still would be quicker than the 3 years. In the remaining of the markets, most of them have the fiber that's necessary. 70% of the fiber deployment that would be the fiber route miles that would be necessary is already in the ground. So in suburban areas where there may need to be some additional build out, within 3 years is not a problem. So we can clear 370 megahertz within the same time frame that they can, and in major markets we can do sooner to accommodate where 5G people that want wireless carriers really need it and are likely to deploy it first.
Peter will give you the final word.
Okay, thanks. Timing is the key advantage for our proposal. We have one entity who's internalizing the cost of delay. All of these plans, none of them are bearing the cost of delay. In 18 months, we will clear 100 megahertz. In 36 months, at least 200, maybe more, will be cleared. If the commission makes a decision this fall, the tentative assignments will be made in the first half of 2020. That will be 2 or 3 years ahead of any of their proposals. That means the day those tentative decisions are made, the winners will be calling Nokia, Qualcomm, et cetera, and saying, I want to flip the switch in 18 months. I want to flip the switch in 36 months. We have a plan to clear as much as is efficient. I'm just not here to say that top-down 500 or 370 or whatever is the right decision. A marketplace solution is the right decision.
Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panel. I will close it by saying the vans will be leaving at the next van to the airport is at 1:30. But also just to say, in appreciation to the panel, Peter began by saying it's maybe the most important thing for the country in 5G. I think Peter and I both, as from the perspective of chiefs of staffs decades ago, understand that there are some decisions which get a lot of publicity that turn out over the fullness of time not to be that important. I completely agree with Peter. This is one that in 2030 we'll be looking back and we'll probably have some criticism of what the FCC did, because there always is that, but hopefully they'll do the right thing and we'll be able to achieve the country's goals. Thank you again very much for the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
And I just want to thank all of you for coming. Thank all of our donors who put up with me and us throughout the year and give us the freedom to do the things we think are interesting. And the staff who did a great job, Ashley and Lindsay and Nathaniel and Joe. One person who I haven't mentioned yet is Jane, and you should come up here. Sure. That would be Jane Creel. So this truly cannot operate without her. And this is Jane's 20th. Not sure exactly how this goes together. Maybe it broke in transit, actually. We'll fix it. Anyway.
What is it?
It's a little, here, it's a little plaque with a thing that goes on top of it. This is Jane's 20th year. For 20 years of kicking ass and making Aspen awesome. So.
Y'all make it fun.
Oh, also, there's one other thing. It's just small, but we know it's something that you can use. A flask. So,
Thank you.
great. Thank you all very much.